All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome back for day two. Hope the reflection went well this morning. For those of you in New York, I'm Greg Kunkel, one of the co-founders here at NextJump. And I'm going to talk today on a little bit more context around our culture of feedback. You saw many of our programs yesterday from 10X. You used the Feedback app. You saw a situation workshop. But I wanted to give a little bit more context on how we fostered truth and transparency within an organization. I think Charlie may have shown this little kind of cartoon image yesterday, but I think we reference this a lot. We reference it on onboarding of how many of us kind of individually want to line up in the comforting lies and how few of us want to get the truth. And I think organizationally, what are the things we've done and how we've gone about setting a culture that more people are lining up and being comfortable both receiving and giving it. So I'll start with just a reminder. This was yesterday. This was a quote from Tom. This is the part around the truth-telling part. So you saw yesterday, I think, some of the recognition. That component is big within that kind of the gas element of building a culture. What I'll do today is try to put some context around the truth-telling part and how we've engineered that within our culture. And I thought an example, I realize it's a busy slide, but I thought in one way it's a bit of an extreme example. However, it's topical, and I think we all struggle with this organizationally. So Wells Fargo, big finance company, they had a challenge within the past year where they had a culture for many, many years of creating and selling false accounts to customers. They ended up, went in front of kind of the U.S. government. I think they let go and fired over 5,000 employees. And what I found was interesting was when the Wells Fargo CEO went in front of the government, he talked about and shared their kind of values document, their vision on the front page of their website. What they talked about to all new hires was this thing: everything we do is built on trust. Is their top kind of value within their values document. And I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he really believed it. I think they organizationally believed it, from the intent standpoint that kind of trust and doing the right thing was there. Yet organizationally within the culture, that didn't happen. And I think there's just a few elements in there of even within, it wasn't just Wells Fargo, within the kind of the finance industry. There's this notion of projecting an aura of self-reliance. My boss would judge me poorly if I had to ask for help. And I think I listed that because that's very relevant to me personally. I struggle with asking for help. I think finance isn't alone. My sister's a lawyer. I think in the legal industry, there's elements in there as well. And I think that correlated to within the kind of the culture itself. There really was this culture of not asking for help, not being authentic, not being vulnerable, and not telling the truth. And especially when you add on top of that, subordinates hear the CEO and with, not just the CEO, with throughout the organization, results matter more than the process of getting there. When you start to add a couple of those components together, you have a recipe where incidents like that can happen. And when the Pace University, the Air Force Academy came. They talked about in the military how they struggle in terms of characteristics and doing the right thing when you put the pressure in within organizationally, and we all struggle with that. And I think the important part from the culture standpoint, it goes beyond the value and the vision of what you talk about, but it's within the rituals and the standards that are setting in the behavior of the organization. So given that, I think the way we think about building a culture of truth-telling, kind of this radical transparency that Charlie talked about, there are a few different components around culture. So we think about intentions, programs, and then kind of the technology, the tools that you use. And really the intentions and the programs, I think, are most important. And in many ways, I think the programs are probably that have the most impact in the day-to-day lives of an organization. So as it relates to this, I think the intentions, the way we talk about truth-telling, is it's helping employees better their judgment, making the right calls. And I won't go into too much more detail. I think Charlie had in his presentation yesterday the why we think is even more important in terms of the world getting so much more uncertain. The reason for really helping employees across the board shape their judgment calls, because mandated leadership model has in many cases started to change into what we think is less effective. So what are some of the programs that we think about? And I'm going to cover, one is practice grounds. And one of the challenges within kind of creating leaders is there's almost a catch-22. Experience matters. Yet you don't oftentimes get to practice decision-making if you don't have the experience because you're not put in position. Yet if you don't practice it, then how do you gain the experience to become better decisions? So it's a bit of catch-22, and we face that struggle. The second part is safety programs and creating a circle of safety. I know there's a lot of questions. Yesterday, we dropped you right in the middle of some of our can't hide programs with 10X. But there is a notion, how do you create this kind of circle of safety where there is psychological safety for it? And then can't hide programs. As we've been able to kind of create safeties of circle, it allows you to push harder. It allows you to push so that people can't hide. And what we talk about is kind of make the right decision, make the wrong decision. But the worst is actually making no decision and hiding. We've invested, in the notion that you can't, these kind of can't hide programs that in many ways you're forced to make some of these decisions. And then the tools, feedback app, which you've used. I'll cover that in a little bit, as well as our evals. How do we, in terms of the actual results, how does it fit into your compensation? How does it fit into your bonus? It's an important element in terms of, building one, because ultimately that hits the pocketbooks of employees. The other element I'll touch on is what are someone asked in the questions and the kind of the pre-surveys, or what are some of the conditions to kind of foster some of the things we're doing at NextJump, and in particular around this investment in building trust. I think there are two conditions that to kind of help and think about to building that foster it. So one is that psychological safety and showing care. Circles of safety is one component of it. We've done other elements of separating development conversations from the actual contributions and the results. There are other elements of which I'll touch on in terms of, which I think even get into this leading by example. Leaders show kind of authenticity, vulnerability. That certainly helps others, take that part of it. And I do think that leading by example, sharing challenges of working on self, the example that's being set, and it could be at the highest levels, but also within teams. Teams, even within an organization, can set the example for other for other teams within the organization that may be more skeptical. So I'll start with the practice grounds, and there are two components of the way we've thought about practice grounds. So the first one is, we use this kind of definition of SHIP. So you may have seen this in the culture tour. But this notion of kind of revenue initiatives versus culture initiatives. So we've done it where everyone at NextJump owns culture. We've seen other organizations, maybe not everyone does, they still have an HR department, but there's certain practice grounds within culture. I think the important notion, that's how we've thought about it, but what are our areas to practice that won't blow if you mess up, you make poor decisions and effects, they're not going to hurt the enterprise. And in fact, in many of the cases, we coach harder on the culture initiatives than we do on the revenue side. In fact, in some cases on the revenue side, the more experienced people might be more mandated in some cases and make some of the decisions where we'll give a lot longer rope on the culture side. So that's one area of kind of giving the practice grounds. That's how we use it and are pretty deliberate with it. The second part is flow. So we use this, what we call kind of, the term came from follower leader model organization, so we're probably grown from like leader to leader in training, so LLTO, I don't know, we haven't changed the acronym, but I think the notion in it is, especially within culture, it's a little bit longer on the revenue side, but one of the challenges we had when we started culture is people are saying, am I going to own the eval process, or I'm going to own Academy forever? Is that going to be in my job description forever? And there was a lot of fear and skepticism, like, I'm signing up for this. And so one of the elements we were able to think about was this kind of flow model where you start as a right hand, left hand, you then go to captain, and then you go to coach. So it's very deliberate in the sense of that you're moving through it, and depending on the initiative, the speed of that can be slow or it can be quite quick. And the notion of a coach is super, super important in the sense of oftentimes the captain's in the ship kind of, making the decisions. The coach is, by the time they graduate, is to leave that initiative, to leave whatever they're working on as a better system from when they started. So they're really thinking about more systematically, and that could be the person, but that can also be the system. And that kind of flow model, so when we run Super Saturdays, for instance, our recruiting events, there's captains, the captains then go to coach the next time. And we do it if the captain really messes up and really does a poor job, we'll keep them in there longer. The point is we want them to learn from their lessons and kind of see some success before moving on to the other place. That model has really helped us in many ways of people being able to go from kind of left hands to see it all the way through the cycle, not getting stuck in one cycle. But there also takes a lot of humility, because in some cases you could be on an initiative where you're the coach to a captain, and in another initiative you might be a captain, right hand to to that captain. So there are times when you're going to be playing different roles within the organization. Just a kind of a quote from Bob Keegan on the, NextJump's this kind of captain creating machine. Part of it is engineering. We really set this up as a practice ground so people are able to practice it and gain that experience where it can show up later. So the safety programs, you've seen some of them. We've certainly talked about them. And I think there's different ways to it, but I think where we've been most deliberate on this is the talking partner is the unit. It's the one place in Academy we're showing situation workshops, inviting that in. No one sees the talking partner. In the sense of those conversations, you can say whatever you want. Nick and Angela, who I coach, I mean, they could be off talking about how, venting about how I've put them in all these positions this time. They're totally overwhelmed. Whatever they say in terms of that's their safest part. They can practice the most, give each other the most feedback. That kind of co-mentoring and it's talked on is the safest circle. I'm not privy to what they're doing, but likewise, we don't share that within Academy. Situation workshop is the next level, and that you often will do that within groups that you're kind of closest to with kind of the next level. You share some of those notes, so it's obviously less safe, but still it's within a smaller unit. You get to know that unit, share kind of where you're vulnerable, where situations, other people are kind of listening in. There's a bond over time around common struggles and other challenges. They'll often work with each other. Then you get into your team. So you'll see today, you saw a bit yesterday, so team could be the company, so 10X, you're giving a presentation there. That's still safer than when you go and give a board presentation. You're going outside and externally to others, outside the kind of the team and the unit. You'll see today in our leadership what we call MV21. You'll see that today. Within that MV20, we have our own rituals where, again, it's less safe than your talking partner or your situation workshop, but it's more safe than when we're going to a board meeting. And so creating, I think, those circles of safety have gone a long way for us. As we built the safety programs, it allowed us to kind of build these kind of can't hide programs. So some examples of them you'll see today, or you saw yesterday with the 10X, you'll see today with OBO. Those are ones where everyone at NextJump has to go and present their contribution, what they're working on themselves. So there's and they get feedback. So that's one element for us. You see in kind of we also have things like Showcase, where employees can go and showcase their products. And so there's a variety of different kind of don't hide programs, but we found it's been super, super valuable as we've built the safety to start. You can't get the truth out, and others can't get the truth if they're totally hiding. So for us, it's been important to put people in front of and getting that feedback. As it gets going, it's kind of a ritual, but in the beginning, there is an element where we had a lot of skeptical people, and I even share the story of I think Charlie talked yesterday, in November, December, if you haven't gone, your names go into a hat and it can get drawn out. We have an engineer in New York who literally took 2 sick days on the days that 10X came. So, and everyone kind of knew it, and now it's kind of a joke, and their managers kind of talk to them. But there's a part where it's known within the organization that happens. So what I thought I'd kind of cap this was, everyone heard Angela go yesterday. I thought she gave a very powerful 10X. And I was sharing kind of afterwards, the part that's very interesting with Angela and Nick, their talking partners, is they're probably in our top quartile in terms of top performers. So I think in most organizations, in our organization, probably 5 years ago, if they had to go in their 10X and give kind of their contribution, this would be what they would show. This is Angela's, for instance, of, she's been here 2.5 years. On the top is the culture and the bottom is the revenue. She's, captained the holiday brunch. She captained Coronitas. She captained one of the most successful Super Saturdays. She spearheaded the entire DDO book launch, which was multiple organizations, all the authors, a whole network of teams in here. She's, running kind of the Boston Academy here. Yet none of that came out in the 10X yesterday, which is very interesting. The other part that's in now, she's a Millennial Ambassador. We looked at all of our top leaders within the organization, and Nick and Angela were the top 2 chosen, the first 2 for us. And on the revenue side, the interesting part is it didn't actually hit in terms of the revenue impact for 2.5 years. She took a bigger role for 2.5 years into it on the revenue side. And I don't think she would have been there for two things. One, she had practice ground. She practiced a lot and very hard on herself, but she practiced in all these initiatives on the culture side. And we get a lot of questions, very reasonable questions on kind of the skepticism. You guys spend so much on culture and other things. How does that, like, doesn't that waste the time and the work? In the short run, without question. Without question for Angela this week, she's hurting on the client side and she could make more progress on the client side. But 2.5 years later, she's taken a role that in many cases, I think 5, 10 years, she advanced in her decision-making abilities and experience that she wouldn't have done. And she's ready for it. The other part, which I think you heard yesterday, is she's practicing on herself for where she wants to go, not reflecting on just what she did to get there. And I think that's uniform at Nexsham. We didn't always used to be there. In fact, I'd be probably the worst culprit of, I'd get kind of criticism of where I could go. I would fight that. I'd say, well, look at the 5, 10 things that I've done and remember those. And I think culturally we've worked on, it's taken a long time, of where do we want to be, not what have we done, and working on that. And I think some of that kind of our programs in there is really helped. So I'm going to turn over to the tools and shift a bit in there. One important part of a kind of the main parts around this kind of candid feedback versus our evaluation process, and I'll walk through both. One big decision we made about 5 years ago is we decoupled feedback from the eval process. We used to run 360s. I'll share a little bit. I've done this for 18 years. It's probably been my biggest challenge, is my least favorite part of my job at the eval process. But decoupling that made a big difference for us in terms of, oftentimes we give the development feedback and really what people said, what's my score? What am I going to get a raise? Am I going to get there's other things going on that they're not really listening to the development. So when we started to decouple, and I'll walk through the part, it didn't work right away, in the sense of there was a high degree of skepticism that the feedback and the performance, the value or the development feedback we're getting wouldn't show up somehow on the eval side. So I'll walk you through kind of what we did on that side. But I think the notion is around the real-time candid feedback. How can you do it in the work all the time? And then the eval part, interesting, because we ended up simplifying it, we made it a lot more lightweight. We actually can do it twice a year now versus once a year. So some of in this feedback, some of the lessons learned, as I explained, we did it intents only, which is our eval process. We also did it top down, so it was very kind of closed door, top down. And the system were built around comforting lies, which I'll explain a little bit more, but the system was, just kind of human nature, let alone in you get peer parts of the eval. People know that in that part it's going to affect your comp. If they like you, they're not going to want to, torpedo your ability to get better comp. So the feedback in there was just a plethora of comforting lies. If I was a manager and I really wanted my employee to be here and to get a raise, there's no way I ding him on the eval process, because I'm nervous that he may leave or not get the raise. So we've started to focus and chipped away at consistency plus intensity. We still have the intensity, but adding in the consistent. 360-degree, really transparent. So transparent that, in the feedback part, that it's not just from the manager, it's not behind closed door. You've experienced certainly some of it yourself in terms of that transparency. It's also peers, but also things like seeing yourself and being able to start reflecting back so you can start to coach yourself. And ultimately bringing this kind of authentic truth and authentic and helpful to the part of making better decisions, using kind of Angela as an example, helping her where she wants to get to tomorrow, not just for today. So 3 key elements. I'll touch on the feedback app. You've all used this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but when we designed it and we kind of iterated on it, 3 very deliberate choices that we made. So the first one was anonymous, and we found that attaching names often can lead to kind of comforting lies versus truth. And I think that some of that can be kind of up, but even within your peer set, it often can be very uncomfortable if you work with somebody, kind of interacting. It's kind of it's just easier to hide in many ways and not give that. And one misrepresentation, I think, is this kind of the truth is, and even internally, it doesn't mean always negative feedback. The truth can be actually the goal that you find within that. The part that we're trying to design it for is to get actually what people really think and what their real reactions are. The second part is transparent. And what we find is that it's helped to reduce the water cooler talk. A lot of times, if we even kept it anonymous, for instance, there are times when I'm giving kind of feedback in here, and I wonder for one of my peers, are they getting this feedback or not? Like, do I need to be the kind of, I'm more, just when you have more kind of responsibility and ownership, you tend to be more direct. So I sometimes be like, I don't have to be the asshole again. But sometimes I wonder, right, are they getting that feedback? When it's transparent, everybody kind of knows. And in fact, sometimes when someone's getting something that's like too much kind of maybe critical feedback, sometimes I might be like, you know what, that's not quite right. I see it, and I can actually, give my own part of maybe a little caveat or a little nugget that actually I think on the other side and explore the part of where I thought they actually did pretty well. If that was not transparent, I'd be sitting there and I might have conversations to Tom, my talking part, and others being like, do you think Albert knows that this is going on? The transparent nature really cuts that out. The third part is meaningful, and one decision we made is a combination of the ratings plus the comment. So you'll notice when you give the feedback in there that we require both. One of the challenges on this is if you give just a rating without the comment, it might not be that helpful. There's no necessarily kind of takeaways. But one of the things we also found that people are generally unpracticed with giving feedback, even anonymously and within it. And oftentimes, they might mean it needs improvement, but the comment can be actually very misconstrued that it's not that bad, pretty good. If you're optimistic, you might see the gold in it. So when you just have the comment, people can see sometimes what they want to see. The rating gives a little bit of a North Star of what their intentions truly were. So that's why we kind of chose it for on both sides. So some of the tips on getting started. So this is just Fraser and Dieter was an organization. It's about a 600-person accounting company, and they came to an academy back last August, something like this, and they've rolled out talking partner and situation workshops, and I just thought I'd share a little bit of what they did. So first, sharing the intent of the feedback. So they started to share that, the intent of this is for development purposes, it's to help you improve. This came from their CEO and one of their kind of talent management leaders. The second piece is the leaders of the team, kind of companies, started to set the example. So they asked for feedback themselves. They shared some of where they were, wanted development areas, and that's how they did it. Fidelity, who we're working with now, they're starting in their Fidelity Labs group. So that's more of an innovative kind of they're doing a ton on the product innovation. So they feel that group. They have some skeptics in the kind of the senior management, but that group, their kind of leaders are. So they're starting within that group and kind of setting the example for others. So, but I think the point being on this is that I do think there's an element of setting the example is important. The other kind of just little tip is meetings are a great way to start. Oftentimes just within the part, people don't walk by and be like, I'm just going to give that person anonymous feedback, especially when that's not built. Meetings are a great way to start. So whether it's something like this and you're giving myself feedback, someone comes up, I can ask for it. So one of the things that other organizations have done is kind of pre-built in is they've saved the last 2 minutes on their agenda just, and say, please put into the feedback app, for instance, some feedback. One of the other parts, which I don't have in there, which I'll take a minute to do, is we also train people and start a discussion for taking ownership of the feedback that in that kind of comforting lines, the people standing in the line for comforting lies. One of the things that I think is misunderstood, there's a lot of, I think, material out there on giving feedback and candid feedback. There's very little on what you can control for receiving feedback. And I'll give you the example just for this. So I'm gonna say two things to you, and just picture yourself. I'm hopeful you give me feedback on this, but emotionally, where would you possibly be? So I'll start with number one, which I've done many of times, by the way. This is the first time I've given this presentation. I just created this last night. I was dead tired. I worked late. My kids are screaming at me. I'm at home. I showed up this morning. I'm pretty tired right now. I'd love some feedback. What do you guys think? Part two. We have so many organizations wanting to build a culture of feedback. They have skeptical people internally. They don't know how to do it. They don't know how to get started. They don't know what fits. They know culturally that this isn't necessarily something that they can, they can't just drop 10x on, boom, onto their, company and have it work. And I want to help. I need your feedback. What helps in here or not? So I could give your solicitation of feedback, and your mindset of giving me feedback is, I hope, going to be a little bit different depending on how I set it. So it's one of the things, even in the onboarding side, we start to share with employees. It's amazing the signals that are just preordained in our life, that we're just ingrained to send out these signals. I kind of want a comforting lie. And you can control that. You can't control the feedback that other people give you. You can control some of the signals that you're sending out. In our eval system, I'll try to keep this short, but this is what we used to do. So we used to have the kind of pen and paper, the 360, the 5-point, part. So this is what we used to do for many, many years. It was a mix of measure of kind of behavior and effort. So it was both the results, but it was also what you were like in teamwork. And I don't know Wells Fargo, but they probably had something in there of some measure of kind of doing the right thing. Like we would have our own version of doing that as well. It was also a kind of a platform for kind of judgment, and it was once a year. It took us about a month and a half to do it. That was being kind. It might have taken us a full quarter. Where we shifted is this focus on contribution. So it's just the results. We focused on this measure of kind of give and take. So the simplest way I can explain it is, I have 20 years here. I have a big team, bigger salary than say Angela does, who has a smaller team, been here 2.5 years. My take is a lot bigger, so the expectation on my give should be a lot bigger. In something like sales, you have very specific results, but it can be difficult when you're in customer service or other, finance or other elements where it's like a little bit, the results may be a little bit fuzzier. So we use this notion of kind of give and take. The platform for truth via feedback, I'll explain that, and then we now do it twice a year, and it's much more lightweight. So 3 key elements to it. I mentioned before, so because for us, contributions to both revenue and contributions, the actual results, when we started to open up for culture and say, okay, you're now required, everyone in Exxon's required to own culture and revenue, until it actually hit the compensation system and the eval system, about 3/4 are coming in and take it that seriously. Once it started hitting the comp, it did. So, and for us, that was a big part that we put our money where our mouth was and said that, you can be a killer on the revenue side, but if you don't develop your people, if you don't, develop kind of the culture side, then you're going to get dinged on that. So it's 1 to 4 ratings on, as you can see in this middle, we used a 4-point scale versus 5-point scale. We eliminated, when you use a 5-point scale, the hiding is kind of a 3, right? Which is where we find the most, and it's the easiest, right? They're kind of in the middle. So we just eliminate that. So a 2 is meet expectations. So if you meet expectations, it's a 2. But there is a bar at that part where we want to see people that are above it. So we just eliminated the 3. And so the highest score you can get would be a 4 and a 4, which would be a total of 8. So 4 in revenue and 4 in. And the general kind of thinking on this is I often get asked, what's a 4? Right? So a 3 in some ways exceeds expectation is you probably, I'll just use a salesperson, for instance, a little bit easier. Maybe they worked really hard and they exceeded their quota, they exceeded their kind of sales target. I'm just saying on the revenue side, that's a 3. If they build a system that not only helped themselves or improved the system, not only helped themselves, but it helped other salespeople within the organization exceed their targets, that's a 4. So it's kind of a system improvement beyond just the hard work that they did. So we give some guidance in terms of what those are. And then what we did is we made it you do your self-evals, and there's a transparent leaderboard in many ways. So everyone in the organization sees what everybody put as their self-eval. The peer evals are anonymous, but what we did on this was to get to this part of truth is oftentimes what people will do is say I'm worried about my comp. I'm going to boost up my eval part, which puts a lot of pressure on the manager in many cases on being the kind of giving a difficult message that, all right, you're not. Peers, though, on the other hand, when you're putting in front of the company, I'm a 4-4. I just was the top performer. You're going to show up at the top. And what we found actually very interesting is that peers will move in. The most feedback is given against people at the top, especially if people don't think they quite contributed to it. But interestingly enough, what I didn't expect was at the bottom. There's another whole kernel. My wife is someone that she has such high standards for herself. Everyone thinks she's great. She always I suck, I suck, I suck. On the flip side, people would give themselves 1-1s, and we'd see an influx of people saying, no, you contributed more than that. That would happen in the beginning. Over time now, I think there's people play less games on it, so they put more, you're putting a target in your back if you put a 4-4. And so I think that it is a little bit more in kind of this part of truth. We also didn't have anonymous peer evals, but it was the same thing I mentioned before in the beginning. It was kind of like people just are uncomfortable dinging somebody or having something that might torpedo it, so we found it would overinflate on the peer evals. So when we made it anonymous, what that ends up happening, and you can see in terms of the process, so I explain a little bit on the self, 30 minutes. We do it in an app itself. You can't write a laundry book. One of the challenges when you write a laundry book is, what jerk is when you list 30 tactical things that you've done, it makes it harder to now say you haven't. When you only have 30 minutes, you got to hit the highlights in terms of how you really contributed to the organization. We give 60 minutes to the peers, so you can kind of choose. You can ask certain peers to do it, but it's, and then for the manager, they get the self-evals and the peer feedback. Ultimately, it is a manager's decision. So ultimately, the manager's ranking matters. The one out we've given on the compensation is we give an out to managers that if the eval rating doesn't add up, we have a general system of, depending on high, medium, or low, is you can ask for an exception on the comp. We'd rather the manager be true in terms of the eval rating, in terms of the actual contribution it's in your record, and give them an out for, there might be circumstances. They may be short on the team. They may, it may be a competitive job position that we need. There may be a slew of different factors that go into that, but we've tried to decouple that as well from the actual contribution process. So I will end with this, because one question we've been getting is all right, so I want to do some of the truth telling and how to get started. And we've actually, it's been hard for us, to be honest, and for organizations that are doing this, we'd love to hear back from you afterwards of what's working, what's not. And I'll share with you some of what's come back to us, because for us too, it's this has been a 5-6 year journey. There are things that we've done along the way. We have a no firing policy. Companies aren't going to start. That's like kind of graduate level safety programs. So we recognize that sometimes it's easier for us to forget. So some of the things that we've seen on this is for some of the programs. One, there's an intense program that's been adopted, which you're about to do, and I'm not leaving any time for Q&A here, I'm sorry, but in about 5 minutes, you'll do a what's working, what's not exercise. That exercise can be very powerful of getting truth and out on the table. And we've had organizations, not only these two, but we've had organizations that literally have brought in new management. They fired half the staff and they're rebuilding, do that exercise to great. So feel free to take that exercise. It's a very powerful one. But from a more consistent program standpoint, we've seen 3 that have been probably adopted the most. Situation workshops. And it's interesting, situation workshops, it could be more the leadership style, but we've also seen it's been very interesting on, the top one that you see there is U.S.S. Michael Monsoor. It's a division of Navy that said, it's the newest, it's a $4 billion destroyer, totally new technology, 31 new technologies that have never been used in the Navy. The normal destroyer ship has 350 sailors. This has 147. So they're in essence tackling way more technology. People are going to have to be much more cross-trained. And so they said, perfect recipe. We need to upgrade the development of our staff because we can't run it in the same way. And one of the things they're doing on the situation workshops is they're testing, the boat hasn't launched yet, so they do all these simulations. So while they're doing simulations, they're also talking and using that time to talk about situations that have come up and talk about the decision making for it. So companies are doing some neat ways that they're testing that situation workshop. But the notion being is that they're bringing their own situation and talking about the decision making, some of the root causes for it. The second one is the feedback app. So we've had organizations just use that as a simple way in many ways to start in meetings and start to get some of that. And then practice grounds. So we've gone very deliberate on using culture on that, but I'll give you an example of U.S. Michael Monsoor of something they were already doing. One of the things that they were already doing was they go and they speak at schools. They speak at schools, they speak in communities, they do a lot of giving. And they would often bring their best people to go do that. And one of the things we talked to them about is why don't you use this for more of your junior people to train them on presentations, train them in terms of, and give them coaching. So the senior person still goes, but the line isn't to make it the best outcome, but use that as part of the development. And so they were like, yeah, that's great. And so that's what they're doing. And so it's not like they've made it their full culture and everyone kind of owning that, but they've taken initiatives that they're already doing and they're starting to leverage that as ways to give as part of kind of leadership decision-making opportunities with more rope. The second part is just tips on overcoming skepticism. And I think as going down this, skepticism will be there. We saw it in the beginning. We still have elements of it. So we've been at this for a long time. One, share the intentions. So sharing the intentions of why you're doing it. And I think it's important not just at the senior levels. It's important throughout all parts of the organization. But then set the examples. And the examples of starting with leadership, starting with pilot groups, there's a part of, we often think about kind of we call it what is and what is not. And so, examples of like what is kind of model behavior of it, but also the standards that you accept, what is not acceptable, it's important. And I think some of those standards can often, as you go through and start things, can often be forgotten. And the last part is experiment with rituals. So I'll give you some examples. So in the feedback efforts, a ritual could be take the last 2 minutes of the meeting. That's like a ritual. Situation workshop could be, so for instance, when we run our situation workshops normally, we do it, everyone in the company at 11 o'clock on Thursday. That's like an hour for us. When Charlie, I think, mentioned yesterday, we do the CEO happy hour where we kind of do our version of cleaning the ship. That's once a month on Friday from 4 to 5. The notion, I don't know if that's the right time. I don't know if that's right. And we experimented with 3 to start, kind of 3 experiments. If it kind of works, we continue. If not, we may adjust. But I think the notion is I wouldn't underestimate the intentions of moving towards making it a ritual within the organization. Because if it's left as a willpower, it's awfully hard to keep that sustainable. So that's it. I totally apologize. I did not leave any time for questions. One lesson, maybe we do this for an hour. So I think we're moving to the what's working, what's not. In the feedback app, I do want your authentic feedback on it. But if you have certain questions in there that you didn't ask and wanted to, if you don't mind putting them into the app itself, we will find a way to somehow address those questions throughout the next couple days. So thank you.